Good afternoon, Patriots. This is the American Vision, broadcast on the TLBTV network and brought to you by the Liberty Beacon Project. I'm your host, Bill Muckler, and I'm coming to you from my home studio in Cocoa, Florida, overlooking Florida's beautiful Space Coast and Cocoa Beach, which everybody confuses Cocoa Beach with Cocoa. Two separate towns, but we're just across the river from each other. And my guest today is just really one of my favorite authors and one of my favorite people, and we've had a chance to chat a little bit. And unfortunately, we're having some technical difficulties, and I'm not sure what we're going to see on the screen with me, but my guest today is Stephanie Parker McKean, and she's coming to us from Scotland, and that may be the reason why we're having some technical difficulties that neither one of us have been able to resolve. And so, Stephanie, welcome to the American Vision.
Well, thank you. I'm very honored to be on your program. Thank you so much for inviting me.
And let me apologize to everyone. Stephanie can see her image and my image on her screen, but all I can see is me. And you really want to see Stephanie. You don't want to see me. And so what we're going to do is we're going to conduct this, and hopefully something good will come. Well, we know it's going to be a great interview because talking with Stephanie is just going to be fantastic. But if we can't see Stephanie, what we're going to do is when she gets over to visit her family in America in November, we'll try and do an interview where we can actually see both of us. So right now, we're not really sure what's going to happen on this, but we know that we're going to have a nice conversation. So Stephanie, I've read your bio and about you, and let's tell some of the people, or let's tell all the people that are watching a little bit about you. You originally grew up in Texas, and you've had all sorts of things happen to you. And I'm thinking, golly, you know, how could all these things happen to one person? So you can tell us maybe about snakes and lions and grasshoppers and all those good things.
Well, I was born in Texas. I mostly grew up in Georgia. And when we were in Georgia, before we moved back to Texas, my family had a little roadside zoo. And I'm not sure exactly how the zoos got started, except all of us love animals. We're crazy about animals. And so we had some neighbors that brought us a baby raccoon that they'd found. The mother had been killed, and a baby fox that they had found. And so it just started out with a few wild animals, and then it's sort of like more people heard about us and brought us more animals. But the real surprise was the day my father brought home a 250-pound lion, an African lion, in the back of the station wagon. And the lion's name was Ebenezer, and he was great. He got out of the car, and my parents always had Great Danes, so the Great Dane dogs were playing with Ebenezer, and he was just romping around the yard just like a big dog, a cat type dog. But anyway, we could walk him on a leash, but he wasn't full grown. And of course, as he grew and as he got bigger, lions are just not meant for pets. They should be wild. They're wild animals. And it's really foolish to keep a big, dangerous wild animal like that as a pet, because when Ebenezer got up to 450 pounds, we couldn't handle him. He was just too big. And so I was at LaGrange College in Georgia at the time, and I invited this young drama department student that I really liked. His name was Ed Martin. I had quite the crush on Ed. And so I invited him home to see Ebenezer. And I didn't realize that Ebenezer had turned into a lion. I thought he was still the big overgrown kitty cat, you know, that we had pet and played with. And so Ed was standing outside the cage, and I opened it up and walked into pet Ebenezer, and Ebenezer grabbed me by the stomach and threw me on the ground and was just mauling me. And Ed reached in and grabbed me and pulled me out of the cage. So I have scars on my stomach from the lion's teeth. And when Ed got me out of the cage, he said, oh, I'm so sorry. I hope I did that right. I've never rescued anybody from a lion before. Anyway, so much for my crush on Ed. That was the last time I ever saw him.
And that was all because the lion was doing what lions do.
Yes, he had grown into a lion. So I discourage people now when I meet them. Some people think it's really unique to have, like, get a baby tiger or get some sort of a wild animal like that. And I try to explain to them that God made those animals there to be wild. They're not house pets. And it's just not good. Especially, it scares me to death when somebody with young children will bring home a tiger or something, thinking that it's going to be this sweet, loving, and they are sweet and loving, but they're also wild animals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
So,
and they grow up.
They do. They grow up, and when they get to 450 pounds, they can pretty well do what they want.
Okay, now tell us about the grasshopper and the silver spoon.
Well, when I was about 5 years old, my first pet was a grasshopper, and I loved that grasshopper. I carried it around. We lived in an apartment complex on the second floor, and I carried that grasshopper around on a silver spoon that my mom let me borrow. And I talked to the grasshopper and sang to it and played with it. And then one day I got too close to the radiator, and the spoon and the grasshopper fell down the radiator. And I was just devastated. I was just crying my eyes out because my pet grasshopper was gone, and my mother was crying right along beside me. And here I am, a little 5-year-old kid, thinking, oh, I've got such a good mom because she cares about my grasshopper. But she was crying because the silver spoon was a wedding gift. And she lost her silver spoon that was a wedding gift. So it took her a while to get over that. And then
the reason I'm asking about these things, because as I read your book and I've read your bio, that this is really you, and you're really telling a story about your stories through your eyes of how you feel and your experiences and your love for animals and love for people and your love for Jesus Christ, our Lord and Savior, because you really have interjected, or maybe that's not the right word, but you use your Christian beliefs and values in your writings.
Well, thank you. And that means more to me than anything else, because my father was an atheist, and I won't go into details, but he was an evil man, very evil. And I hesitate to talk about it because I still have two brothers, younger brothers in Tampa, Florida, who don't know the truth and don't understand everything that happened. They were too young. But because he was an atheist, he would not allow us to have a Bible in the house. We never got to go to church. One time, my mother let us go to vacation Bible school, and when we came home singing, Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so, my father just absolutely got ballistic and ordered us to never go to vacation Bible school again because they were warping our minds. And he wrote 4 books that were they were about guy, a boat skipper that would go out and rescue boats that had sunk. I can't remember what it's called right now, but being in Florida, you probably know what I'm talking about. Anyway, he wrote 4 books about this skipper, and the books were so anti-God. And so when I started writing books and getting them published, I prayed and I said, Lord, they're out of print now, thankfully. But I said, Lord, there's 4 books that my father had put out there that are just horrible, and that are against you. Please, Lord, let me write books that point to you. And so that's so important to me. I have more than 4 books now. In fact, I think I have, it's 17 or 19. I don't remember. I forgot to count. But all of them, I don't preach in them, but they're intended to be a witness to the Lord in a conversation. Things that won't turn off the reader by thinking that they're being preached to, you know, in the conversation, in the action of the characters, in the plot, because it's very important to me. If anybody still remembers those horrible 4 books that my father wrote, I would like to have something out there that I contributed that is against that, showing the other side.
Well, according to Amazon, I counted, I think, 18 or 19 books that you've written and had published. So you're quite a prolific author. And fortunately, and this is something that I wanted to mention, and I've talked about this before, is I really do not like this whole social media aspect of our lives and how we're so indoctrinated by Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and everything else. But there are some real good things that come out of it, besides grandmothers, sharing their recipes and pictures of their grandchildren, which I guess are some of the real nice things that Facebook originally was supposed to be all about. But it's allowed me the opportunity to meet a lot of people, and I've met a lot of authors. And when I see an author that I think, gosh, I'm really interested, I'd like to read their book. And so that's how I found Stephanie. I found her book, and well, I found a lot of her books, but the one that really caught my attention was one, I guess you published this maybe about a year ago, and we can't see the entire book cover on there, but it's called Growing Your Monster. And I started reading this, and when I got through the first few pages, I thought, gee, I don't know if this is a book I'm really going to be interested in, because it seemed like it was a book about children. And then what I discovered, but every time I start reading a book, I read it all the way through, cover to cover, because every book I find at least 1 or 2 or 3 good things in there that really have an impact on me. And once I started reading this book, I got into it, and I thought, wow, this book is so great on so many levels. Stephanie has just written a book that is, telling us so many stories and giving us such a great picture of life. So would you mind telling us a little bit about how you got the idea to write the book? And also, I had to learn a whole new language in the book, because you told it through like a young children and teenagers vocabulary.
Well, thank you. I'm glad you really liked the book. And it was, I don't mean to sound, I've heard of people being accused of having false humility and things, but really and truly, I could not write a book without the Lord's help. I just couldn't. In fact, I tell people a lot of times that he's the author and I just do the typing. And Growing Your Monster was actually something I wrote for a 3-day book contest in the U.S. over Labor Day weekend. They hold a contest, and you're supposed to write a complete book in the 3 days. And it has to be over 200 pages. I think it's 200. It's been a while since I've read that book. But anyway, the Lord gave me the idea, and I just sat down, and I'm thankful to have a very supportive husband who's also an author, Alan McKean, and he just sort of took care of meals and took care of everything that needed to be done. And at that time, he was a pastor in a church of Scotland. So he even had to go to church by himself because I couldn't leave the computer and still finish the book within 3 days. And the basic premise of it is it strikes a blow against political correctness, because we're not allowed to say, for instance, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth, male and female. When he created man, male and female. Now there's an attack on calling people men or women, or saying that God created male and female. And it's there's an attack against calling sin. It's seen as being very judgmental and not, not nice, mean-spirited to say, oh, that's a sin. And so that was the premise behind Growing Your Monster, is that the truth is the truth, and it doesn't matter what label you put on it. For instance, people think that it's just terrible to call abortion murder. They want to label it a woman's choice. By labeling it a woman's choice, they think that gives them the right to have an abortion and to support abortion. They don't understand that murder is murder, and God said, I called them out of the womb. He said, I knew you in your mother's womb when I knit you together. And so that was the whole premise of the book, that changing labels and calling something by a nicer name doesn't make it right. Sin is still sin, and the Bible says, whatsoever you sow, you shall reap. And in Growing Your Monster, the family was wound up sort of shattered and exploded because they wandered into sin and stayed there. And so it's sort of a picture of how that happens so innocently and so quickly, and then it just sucks people in. In Growing Your Monster, I called these monsters alts, for alternative lives, which is alternative lifestyles. And people, when they saw the little bitty monsters living in their house, they thought they were so cute. Oh, look at him, he's so cute, he can stay here. They didn't comprehend that any little sin you have doesn't stay little. It grows, and it becomes the monster, and it possesses you. And that was really the idea behind the book.
And the way you told the story was really through the eyes of the youngest son, who the parents and the teenage son and daughter just really ignored. He felt like he was invisible, and I think there's a lot of young children that are going through life today that feel like they're invisible because of the morality that we have in America today.
I agree with that totally, and that is what the Kevin, he was 7 years old, and like you said, he was convinced that he was invisible because everybody's priority was themselves. Nobody had the priority of actually listening to Kevin or talking to him, or they didn't take him seriously when he tried to explain to them that Cinny, the monster Cinny that was in the house when they bought it, was actually had a connection to sin, and that he grew as they sinned. It's kind of an allegory of him reflecting what people would like to call bad lifestyle choices or unwise lifestyle choices: alcohol, drugs, sex outside of marriage, things that the Bible says no, don't do. That's a sin. But nowadays it's called, I think over here in the UK, for example, it's a lot more common for people to have partners than for people to get married and be husband and wife. And it's perfectly accepted. Partners have the same legal rights as people that are actually married. So it's just, Growing Your Monster was just trying to make people stop and look and think, you know, maybe God is right. Maybe his word is right. Maybe there is a danger of sin or with sin.
And in the story, and what you're explaining is probably a much deeper meaning than what I got out of it. But eventually, as their sin grew, they grew apart, and to a point where their whole family was completely shattered. The son got on drugs, and the daughter, the older son, teenage son, got on drugs. The older daughter got tied up with a boyfriend who was into all sorts of bad things. The mother started out in an affair, and everybody just was completely shattered because of that. And that's really what's happening in many American families today.
That's true. That's what gave me the idea, is sadly seeing the sad impact of things like that, and recognizing how it starts out small. You know, maybe oh, I'm just going to go hang out with my friends tonight and have a few drinks, I'll be okay. Or maybe just small beginnings. Sin takes its Satan came to kill and steal and destroy, and he's doing that today, and he does it by knowing which tool to get out of the toolbox to tempt people with. And it starts out so small and innocuously, and then it just, like you said, it just grows and grows, and then all at once it shatters before people even realize that that's where they're headed.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about let's get back to you. And what I'd like to do is tell everybody that Stephanie is really a hero of mine, because Stephanie is a Marine mom. And you always hear me talking about how much I love Marine moms, the greatest people in the world, because after all, my mom was a Marine mom as well. So, you know, I'm very, very, I don't know the right word to say, but anyway, Stephanie, your son it did something that I guess was very similar to what I did, became an officer in the United States Marine Corps. And I saw a picture of him in a captain's uniform, and I thought, oh my gosh, I wore a captain's uniform at one time. I hope I was as handsome and looked as well as he did. And your son Luke was really an exceptional officer in the Marine Corps, but he also had some great qualities that I think we can all be very proud of. And maybe you can tell us a little bit about your son, because it's a good story, but also a sad story.
Well, when Luke was about 4 years old, he wanted to play with G.I. Joes. And I wasn't that excited about G.I. Joes, but the pastor of our church said, oh, let him play with them, he'll outgrow them. Well, by the time he got to be 17, he had decided on the Marine Corps. And so he ran every day. He would, instead of walking home from school, he would run home from school. We were blessed enough to have a small Christian school in the Texas community where we were living. And I did not know until years later, when I worked at a newspaper, I had to write down the mileage because I went to cover a fire, and I had to keep my mileage for the paper. I did not realize that he had been running 8 miles a day, running home from school. And he did this up until he was 18, graduated from high school, and went straight into the Marine Corps. And he worked his way up from enlisted to when he went home to be with the Lord. He was a major. And when he was still in basic training, he called me, and he said, Mom, I just have to thank the Lord for protecting me last night, because he said the guys in my unit got drunk and they wanted me to drink, and I wouldn't drink with them, and they got angry. And so he said they got out their knives and they started stabbing my bed. And he said, I just pulled the sheet up over me and prayed and went to sleep. And he said, in the morning when I woke up, I had knife cuts all over my mattress, but praise God, he wasn't touched. And I was one angry mama. I wanted to storm up to Washington and tell them what I thought about them letting my son get put in that kind of danger. But he wound up, he was in Iraq 4 times. He was in Afghanistan twice. When he was in Iraq, the last time he was there helping, it was right before Iraq was returned, the control of Iraq was returned from the U.S. back to the people. Mm-hmm. So he had to go over there and learn to speak, I'm not going to say it right, not Arabic, they had to learn to speak the language and help them. He was training the police force for taking over when the U.S. left. Mm-hmm. And he was featured in one of their newsletters that his platoon wrote, and they said, we get so frustrated with Captain Parker. Back then he was just a captain, because we can't make him cuss no matter what we do, not even if we hide his weapon. And then they said, and we can't make him drink no matter what we do. And so when I read that, I just thought, oh, thank you, Lord. That's because when he was hyperactive before it was a buzzword. And when he was young, I was told, I was a single parent, and I was told that he was going to have learning difficulties and he needed to go to a special school. And I just insisted on him staying in the Christian school and said, look, test him again in 6 months, because I really believed in our curriculum. And sure enough, in 6 months, he was ahead of the other kids his age. So he, except for a couple of years when there was no Christian school where we lived, he graduated from a Christian school, and he carried that with him, his love for God. He carried that with him into the military. And his Bible, which I would show you, but of course you can't see because we can't see each other. He kept it on his desk. He was when he became an officer, if people came to him for help, he always had the Bible sitting on his desk. It's basically underlined, dog-eared. He took it with him everywhere. But his wife gave it to me after his plane crash, and he learned to fly a plane, and he bought one of the last 19 Focke-Wulf planes in the world, and that's what he was flying when he had his crash. He was going to Arlington National Cemetery to participate in a memorial service for one of his Marines that had died, and his plane went down in North Carolina, and so that was in 2013. So that was the worst day of my life. And he had written a prophetic poem a year before that crash, and it's in my second book that I wrote, Bridge Beyond Betrayal. And when he wrote the poem, it scared me to death, and I called him up and I said, Luke, why did you write this poem? And he was saying, Mom, calm down, don't worry. It was just something that came to me. And then it happened just exactly like he wrote in the poem a year later.
So, yeah, very prophetic, and such a sad thing to lose such a wonderful person and wonderful son. I certainly, I having never known him, but what little I know about him, I certainly admire and respect everything. And of course, I know what it takes to become a Marine officer. So we're all, have a special bond with each other. So even though you've had all these things happen to you, and let me go back a little bit, because in reading your new book, Complete Disclosure, it takes place in Texas on a ranch, and you actually, in the beginning of the book, the person who is that the book is about, uh, her name is Sage, I believe it is. She it comes to this ranch, and she's given a room to stay in, and she's supposed to write a book about the lady and her longhorn cattle. And I got the feeling that was you were really writing this about yourself, that you're an author, and that you would be telling a story that you would actually write yourself.
Well, it's, really and truly the Lord. I don't even know. I had a long talk with him the other night and said, Lord, how do you do it? How do you give me these ideas and these books? Where did they come from? I can't remember where. That just came from a little idea. And the Lord it just wound itself into a book. But there was a marvelous lady in Bandera, Texas, and I was very privileged to get to interview her and take pictures of her. And I was not a real close friend, but her name was Maudine Marks, and she is known for having the purest breed of Texas Longhorns. It was her daddy's dream, and so she took it as her own to raise these cattle, because they were going extinct. They're these iconic cattle that are in all the old westerns, and it's the stuff that cowboys are made of. The books, the movies, and Maudine she didn't want that to go out, and so she started raising these Longhorns. And there are several people in Bandera now that have Longhorns, that ride them, that bring them to town and let people take pictures on them. And I mean, Maudine really started something with her Longhorns. And so I really, I wrote a couple of magazine or newspaper articles about Maudine, never a book or anything. But I suppose the part of me that the Lord drew out as I wrote the book was because I let her lose her young daughter. And of course, I've lost Luke, so I didn't lose him. He's in heaven, but I mean, I've lost him to this life. So I was drawing on how I felt, how I thought she would feel losing a 2-year-old daughter to a rare form of cancer.
Yeah, I saw a connection there, and I presume that you were writing about your own feelings. And also in the beginning of the book, and this will really take a left turn for you, is you looked in the shower, and there was a rattlesnake in the shower. And I'm thinking, but when I read Stephanie's biography, she actually used to have play with snakes, but was actually bitten by a snake at one time.
Well, that's true. I was the weird kid that nobody liked, and so I found out that I could really impress other people by handling snakes, because everybody else was afraid of them. And so I was so silly at the time that I would even ride a bicycle with a snake wound around my neck, because it impressed the boys. It scared them to death. They ran away, but it impressed them. But anyway,
I would have run away too.
Yeah, it wasn't probably the kind of impression I wanted to make. But because of not being afraid of snakes, in Georgia, we had this thing called 4-H, and there was a camp every year. If you won your project demonstration on the county level, you would get to go to the 4-H camp and do it again there. And if you won there, you could go to state. And so all of us, my brothers and sisters and I, we always won every year and got to go to Eagle Rock to the 4-H camp. And while I was there, I did help a young man milk a rattlesnake. I doubt, but my hand was shaking. I wasn't much help. My hand holding that beaker was shaking so hard. I'm amazed that I didn't drop the glass. But the way I got bitten was, we had a program called the 4-H Hour that was on every Saturday. And I got invited to be on the 4-H Hour with my snakes and to show people how to tell a poisonous snake from a harmless snake, because poisonous snakes have diamond-shaped heads. Harmless snakes, except for coral snakes, have round heads. And so I gave the demonstration on television. That was on a Saturday. Sunday morning, I was down at the pond, and a couple of boys from our neighbor friends that came over a lot, they were down there, and we saw this snake in the mud at the pond, and they were going, "What kind of snake is that?" So I said, "Well, I don't know, but I'll find out." So I put a stick over its head, and I picked it up, but it was all muddy from being in the edge of the pond. And by the time I picked it up, instead of having it behind its head, I had its tail, and it reached up and bit me, and it was a water moccasin, and it bit me on my right hand. And so I had to go to the hospital, and I thought when they froze, they had to freeze my hand until the antivenom came. And I thought that was the worst pain I'd ever had in my life until they unfroze it after they gave me the antivenom. And then I don't know which hurt worse, but I have not picked up poisonous snakes and played with them since.
I don't blame you a bit, because I've never handled one before, and I hope I never do. But also in your book, you talked about the heroine. I'm going to just call her the heroine. Her name is Sage. That's who the book is about. And she befriends a young lady character. Her name is Carrie, who is in love with this guy who's really a mean guy, and he's abusing her, beating her up, and everything like that. And Sage goes to her rescue. And I thought that was great, because it sort of highlighted what's happening in America today. I can't believe anybody would lay a hand on a woman. A guy would do that, because that's just not what we do, and yet it happens so often. And you're telling that story as well.
Well, I know I'm like you. I guess we sort of grew up at probably around the same time. And when I was growing up, it was absolutely unheard of, or as far as I knew, our men just didn't hit women or beat them up or anything. But then I have, I guess also it goes back to having worked at the paper, where I've had to interview women and help women who needed to get out of abusive situations and get into shelters. And so I've seen that. And usually either the abuser or both of them, it almost, I would say it almost always involves alcohol or drugs or both. I mean, that's usually what seems to set it off. But I have sadly interviewed some women and that needed to get out of situations like that. And I know people that haven't got out that have been very badly hurt. And so that's close to my heart. And to be honest, I mean, Luke's dad, Luke was only 2 years old when I divorced his dad. Part of it was constant mental abuse, but the other part was one time he was also abusive to Luke, and when he hit Luke one time, that was it. I picked Luke up and went out in the desert. I had no job, no place to stay, no money, no vehicle, but I had Luke and he was safe, and I just started over from there. And so I do have a real heart for people that have been through that. And so often the women, they're either afraid to leave, which it's good to be afraid of that, because sometimes the abusive spouse comes after them, or they have this unrealistic look at themselves. They don't understand how valuable they are. God made them. God loves them. Jesus died for them. They are worthwhile. But they think that if they don't stay with this man, they'll never have anybody else. And so they just tough it out.
Yes, and so in your story, you tell about this, and it gets us to understand better that women who have little or no self-esteem and feel like they're worthless, they have no value. They really do, and there is a way for them to get out. And in that case, the head of the ranch, I can't think of her name right now.
Petra.
Yeah,
Petra.
Petra. Yes, Petra and her brother Peter, the missing brother Peter. Petra actually comes to the rescue of young Carrie and gives her money to attend college because young Carrie is really a person who loves animals. So, see, as I'm reading this, I'm seeing you in so many ways in these books and your stories, and that to me is so important because I know that what you're doing is you're writing from love and your feelings and your compassion and you're telling a story through your eyes.
Well, I remember when I was probably 21 years old, I wanted to be a writer. I've wanted to be a writer since I was 11 years old. It's all I ever wanted to do, ever. And when I was about 21, I attended this writing class over in Kerrville, Texas. And the lady said, write what you know. And I was a new Christian. I had just been saved. I mean, I don't even think I'd started reading the Bible, but I had just accepted Jesus into my life. And then I go to this writing class and she says, write what you know. And I said, Lord, how can I write what I know? I don't know anything. Lord, please help me so I have something to write. Be careful what you pray. Be careful what you ask God for, because in order to have something to write about, I had to go through some things, because I wouldn't have known about I wouldn't have known how Sage felt about losing a daughter, but I've lost Luke. I wouldn't know how Carrie felt about the abuse and everything, except, I was in that place.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't have known so much of the other books. Love's Beating Heart that I mentioned was anti-abortion. I was abused sexually as a child. I got pregnant when I never even had a date. Didn't have a boyfriend, never had a date. Boys, like I said, would run away from me because I was the girl with the snake around the neck. But anyway, I was forced to get an abortion because the perpetrator didn't want to be found out. And what was even worse than that, well, no, I guess that wouldn't be worse than that. Actually, it was a miscarriage, but it was more or less a forced miscarriage. The perpetrator had me go to the police station and claim that I had been raped and look at mug shots. And it scares me to death today when I think back, because I always had a vivid imagination. What in the world? What if I had seen somebody's face in the mug shots, and in my childish, because I was only 13, in my childish imagination, pointed at somebody and claimed it was them. And this was back before, I don't think they did that much. Well, they didn't have DNA testing. I might have been responsible for some poor man being locked up in prison for like all his life or something. So it's a terrible memory. But then I got pregnant again at 15 because the abuse was continuous, and never had a boyfriend, never went on a date or anything. And here I am, 15 years old, and that time it was a backwoods abortion. Both times I almost died. So I wrote this book, Love's Beating Heart, and there were two parts of it. One was the young girls fleeing, a young girl that got pregnant fleeing to keep from having an abortion. And the other part of it was her sister, who thought it was okay to come in and break up a marriage because she kind of liked the looks of the guy, in spite of the fact that he had a wife and I think it was 4 children. So the book was actually a parallel book in two segments, but that definitely drew on my past experiences, because I'm so, when I realized that when I get to heaven, there's going to be 2 children that I never got to meet, that used to belong to me, that God made, that God created. And because of me, they're not, they never got to live down here. So that's sort of, so the things I've been through, they do is somehow get mixed up into the books, but it's always God that gives me the idea and the way to mix them up and make it a story and not something that just preaches to people. Because if people pick up a book, and if they're not Christians and they pick up a fiction book and they think they're getting preached to, they just put it down again.
No, the way you write is very effective, at least. And I know I really enjoy your books, and I plan on reading more. And your books are so well written, and they tell the story so well that I would encourage everyone to read your books. So your books can be found on Amazon, and even though you're in Scotland, people here in America, you can buy the books off of Amazon. That's what I do. That's how I get them, and you just have to go and look for them and purchase books. So anyway, I think both of us, Steph and I, would encourage people to do more reading and less TV watching and less video games or whatever, however you spend your time, and read, because you can learn so much by reading.
Yes, I would agree with that totally. Yes. And they are available in the US on Amazon, and over here, of course. Actually, I think they've made the top 25 books or so in the US. I don't mean they're there all the time, but so people do find them. And when I had a publishing company, they were available at Barnes and Noble and in paperback and all that. Some of them are still available in paperback on Amazon, but really and truly, I think most people nowadays read on their phones or on Kindles, or they don't. Books are big and bulky to carry around. Then when you get through reading them, you have to find a place to put them, unless you give them away to someone.
I know. I've run into that. There's been several times over the past years where I'll end up boxing up like about 50 books. I just took 50 a few months ago over to the senior center, and they were so nice. They wrote me a thank you letter and sent it to me. I couldn't believe it, so, but now I read almost everything on Kindle. And Stephanie's books are all available on Kindle, and they're priced really well. So nobody can tell me they can't afford the book, because you can't afford not to buy the books and read them.
Oh, well, thank you. That's a nice thing to say. Yeah, they're all 99p in the UK, and in the US they add tax, so it's like $1.37.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, actually, when being in Florida, when I buy your books, they're 99 cents, and that's all I ever get charged. And I'm thinking, Stephanie, you really need to charge more for your books, because they're worth a heck of a lot more than that.
Well, thank you. Well, when they were with the publishing company, she had, they cost a lot more. But I'm more interested in people buying the books, reading them, and especially if it's somebody that has a shaky relationship with the Lord. I'm hoping that the faith that the characters exhibit in the books will bring them back to God. That's more important to me than the price.
Yes, and for those who have never written and had a book published before, authors don't make any money off of this. If I got a penny an hour for every hour I put into my books, I would probably be a millionaire, and I'm not. Anyway, I think we probably can close on a real positive note here. We want everybody to read your books, and do you have a website that you have your books on, or a Facebook page that you can tell us about?
Well, I don't have a web page. I have what's called an author's page on Amazon. If they type in Stephanie Parker McKean, my website, my author's page will come up with all the books. Amazon's done a really nice job of putting them all together and the reviews and everything. It's all right there. And then on Facebook, I have a Miss Mike page, because I have 8 books that are my hero is a Texas amateur detective named Michael Allison Rice, and her friends call her Miss Mike. So there's 8 of those. They're all funny, and that's why I called it the Miss Mike page from my author's page. But it's hooked up to my Facebook page.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so Stephanie, I'm just so glad that we had a chance to finally talk to each other, and I apologize to everybody for not knowing how to get the video to work, and maybe it's just because I've never had an interview with someone from Scotland before, that there's something there that is preventing us, the technology is preventing us from getting the picture. And so I'd like to close out by thanking Steph for being my guest on the show. And God bless you, Stephanie, and God bless all of our armed forces personnel and our fallen heroes and our vets. And God bless America.
And God bless you. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. It's my pleasure. Okay, boys and girls, I hope you enjoyed our conversation with just a really exceptional woman. Stephanie is just, we email all the time. This was really the first time we've had a chance to talk, and we probably spent about a half an hour or more trying to figure out the technical issues of why we couldn't get video from Scotland over here to America, to Florida. But I'm not sure how all this is going to look, but I know the interview was fantastic, and Stephanie is such a fantastic person. I have so much admiration and respect for her and what she's doing, and for her writings and everything like that. So anyway, buy her books. You'll really love this Complete Disclosure, and her other book, well, I guess all 19 books. And this one that was set in the desert, that's Growing Your Monster, which is really a book everybody should read. And so please read and buy books. And after you buy Stephanie's books, you can go ahead and buy my book and read my book too. And I just want to let you know that none of us authors are getting rich off these books. In fact, it costs us money to do all this. And what's happening is we just write things because we want you to know how we see things, and we're hoping that we can impart a message to you that is really of great value. So anyway, I will say again, God bless our vets, our active duty personnel, all Americans, every one of you that's watching this, and God bless Stephanie for being a wonderful guest on my show. And God save our America, because we need you now more than ever before.